Yep. Okay. So today we took a lot of questions. We had a lot of great feedback from folks, and we tried to whittle it down to the most asked questions. We want to talk about today. We wanted to talk about how and when to share with your child and family friends about the donor conception. How to choose a donor came up a lot, and I think that's a really confusing and difficult question. And we want to talk about issues of privacy versus secrecy, and a lot of these things touch upon each other. So should we start with how to choose a donor?
Why not?
Yep.
Okay. Terry, would you be willing to share your story? Because I know it's 26 years ago now, but you can give us a little bit of history and some of the questions that came to mind when you were choosing a donor.
Sure, absolutely. So my husband and I faced male factor infertility as well as some female factor infertility. I had some issues as well, but we were eventually able to use my eggs. Back in 1993, 1994, there was not a lot of disclosure about donors' religion or background. There wasn't a whole lot of information. We went with a bank that had the greatest number of Jewish donors because that was very important to both my husband and I. And Eric, my husband, wanted a child that sort of looked like him. Well, he and I have the same color hair. We have the same color eyes. We both have curly hair. So that was fairly easy. We looked at all the Jewish donors. I sort of looked first, I think, and narrowed it down to 5 that I liked. I didn't tell him anything about why I liked those donors, and then he evaluated them. We then did sort of a blind where we put our first choice, our second choice, and our third choice in order, and they happened to match. And so our first choice was the one that we went with. By then, you had to request a long profile. And later, through another mom, I learned out that we didn't have the only profile, that she had been given a different one. But we chose a donor whose personality really would be somebody who would want to hang out with, somebody who seemed to be a kind person, a menschy guy. And I was very drawn to his handwriting because that's how profiles were done at that time. Very artistic, creative, a little bit like me, and it just spoke to me. And that's how we did it.
So even 25 years ago, you got enough information in the profile that you were able to choose somebody who, number one, fit your ethnic criteria, Jewish, and number two, had some similar features to both you and Eric, and then also shared common interests with you.
Yes. We also, it was very important that our donor be bright and motivated, just like we wanted to raise our kids, bright, motivated kids. And there's some genetic component to that somewhere along the line. So we looked for those qualities.
Alana, is there anything you wanted to share?
Yeah. So I think in our case, one of the things that I talk about when people kind of reach out to me personally about my embryo donation experience is we were coming from a place where we were trying to have, I don't know what we call a mainstream adoption. We were trying to adopt from foster care and doing all the, today's research, we very much understood for our family, it was best to have an open adoption. So we were coming into the space for embryo donation with that knowledge. And so it was important for us when we were going to receive a donated embryo that we were going to have a relationship with at least one part of the recipient and the donor family. So one of the things we wanted to make sure is, would we get along with her and would we get along with their family, because they were going to be in our life for good or for bad forever. And instantly we knew, okay, maybe we were not going to be best friends, but we connected deeply. and we had similar values, and she was not trying to raise this kid, but we knew that that we were coming from a similar place, I suppose, religiously in our Jewish faith, and that made a lot of the conversation, setting the stage of what we wanted and didn't want in this relationship, a lot easier for us.
Thank you. Carol, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can say a few words about donor selection for egg donation. Although I am a mom via egg donation, I had my son so long ago, 32 years ago, that the system was very different, and there was no egg donor selection at that time. The donors, women were not recruited in the same way they are now. But I can speak to the last couple of decades of working with people who do select. And so many people initially go into donor selection, whether sperm or egg, looking for a similar look, someone who looks like them. And of course, what a lot of times they're looking for is a reproduction of themselves, a cloning of themselves, the characteristics they have. But sometimes it's just a matter of having a child who physically fits into the family. And what I tell people is the only thing that physical similarity gives you in donor selection is that it makes the way you created your family less public. So if you have a child who looks distinctly different from you, and I often tell a story about me having two very, very blonde children, and I used to have pitch black hair and very dark skin. Everywhere we went, people wanted to know how I got two blondes. So it's a very public family in that regard, because that's the first thing people notice. But beyond that, and because children's looks change over time. My kids were both dark brunettes by the time they were 6, but they were blonde, when they were younger. I always recommend to people when they ask is to choose someone who speaks to your heart, to choose someone who, to the best of your ability, by reading these profiles that you get, that something jumps out at you that makes you feel like you would love to spend a couple of hours with her at Starbucks. Or because there's often a very big age difference between recipient and donor, that you would feel really proud if that was your daughter or that was your niece and somebody you'd really like to get to know more. And fortunately, for a lot of the agencies now, there's so much information on the profile that you can really get that. It might be, as you were saying, Terry, a sentence or a turn of phrase. It might be the way she talks about her family of origin. But when you're talking to your kids about how you created your family, you're talking about somebody who gave half of who your child will be. So having a feeling of, how she spoke to you metaphorically and how you felt about her is going to come through when you talk to your kids, rather than, I don't know, it was just somebody and she had my eye color and that's how we chose. So it's a great way of sort of honoring that piece in your kids. And I think it helps people go into the process just feeling so much better about who that person is than just vital statistics.
I really like that, Carol, and I like that advice that you give to parents to think about your child in this. That is, number one, is your child going to get questions in public about how they look or how they fit into your family that are going to make them uncomfortable? And number two, how would you explain this to your child? How will your child internalize and incorporate that into their psyche, into their being, of who this person will be in their lives, or who this person is in their life and in their creation? And the fact that you will choose someone that you might like or respect, or that might fit in your family, or that you might like to spend a weekend with. I think that says a lot to your children. and the fact that you're thinking ahead or advising people to think ahead on how you will tell your children the story and how you chose the donor means a lot. I would also like to add that many people who do choose on certain characteristics may be thinking about DNA as a recipe, that you take DNA from A, DNA from B, and then you get child AB. And we all know, or many of us understand as we get older, that this is just not the case. And that is really the miracle of life, that you take DNA A and you take DNA B and you get every variation therein, and you may like, where does this one come from? And it's not a recipe. And I think our job as parents is to love our children for who they are, and not for how they are an extension of us or what we wanted them to be or thought they would be.
Also, I'm not sure that the question about physical appearance is not necessarily upsetting or disturbing to kids. Some people are, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but some people are more private than others and don't want to be approached with those things. I think kids often don't care, especially in very young ages. I know my kids would always say, like, why is everybody so interested in my blonde hair? Like, what is the big deal? So I don't want to give the impression that that's necessarily disturbing to children. You know, a transracial family is a very different story, and that can bring up other issues. So I just wanted to say, for a lot of kids, like if they have red hair and nobody else has red hair, it's going to attract a lot of attention, but the kid may not care. And depending on how it's handled, the kid may feel really special about that.
I was just going to add that one of the first things that my half siblings and I bonded about was our physical characteristics, because we met when we were 8 years old, and at that point we weren't as understanding of what personality traits we shared, so we always thought that was really fun, and that's something that I actually think I can find a deeper meaning in, is, oh, I look very different than a lot of people in my family, so that comes from my donor. And even though for most of my life I didn't know what he looked like until a few years ago when I saw a picture, it was still a really cool idea to think I look how I am, and that's different than a lot of my family because of this man who donated his sperm. So I do think that it's not like physical appearance holds no weight, but I do think that it's something that made me closer to my siblings at first, at least. Something that we think about a lot, or thought about as kids when we first connected.
Thank you.
I like that. Dr. Berman, maybe this is a good time to ask the question about the consultant and matchmakers in the process of streamlining how to find a donor.
Yeah, actually, we got a wonderful question on the chat about someone feeling overwhelmed. One of our attendees said it's pretty overwhelming to look at the sperm banks or the egg banks and the embryo agencies, and to figure out, like, how do I sift through that? Is there somebody who does this for a living? Is there somebody who will help people whittle this down a little bit? And Carol, you said you know some agencies or some concierge services.
Yeah, would you like me to say those names now, or do you want to put it on the website? Or yeah, there are 2 consulting services that do exactly that. They're matchmakers. So they take the information from you as the recipient about, you know, the ethnicity of the person you're looking for, education level, what is important to you, and then they have the connections to a gazillion agencies around the country, so you're not doing the one by one. And the first one is called Family Match Consulting, and that's in the Los Angeles area. The person who owns that business is Stephanie Levitch. She's wonderful to work with. Very, very helpful, very kind. And the other is a larger organization, and that's called Donor Concierge, and that's in the Northern California area, run by a woman named Gail Anderson. So there you go. It certainly adds a layer of cost to the cost of an already pretty expensive proposition. But, for people who are either looking for a needle in a haystack or, have very limited time, it's an extremely helpful process. And as you said, Lauren, also overwhelming. And so they can kind of take the scary out of it.
And we just got a question that's related that somebody was going on websites looking for a donor, and then they found somebody they liked, and then they realized that the donor was no longer available.
Yeah, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. And so what I do tell patients is that if you find someone you like, don't think about it too much. Again, it's not a recipe that you're going to take this DNA and that DNA and make the perfect child. That if there's somebody that you feel comfortable with, go ahead and put your deposit down or grab that donor. Carol, do you have a different opinion on that?
I guess my opinion is that when you move forward, when you have your child, you will inevitably, and I'm not a big believer in fate and destiny and all those things, but I've never met a parent through any of these alternatives that didn't say, oh, now I know why that donor fell through. Now I know why my eggs didn't work, because this is clearly the child that was supposed to be mine. So I think it's risky to kind of fall in love instantly with one particular profile. Remember, these are not people we're falling in love with, really. They're vital statistics and profiles. And if it turns out that that person isn't available, it's incredibly frustrating. And people who are not available should not be on the websites. And it happens all the time. But I just want people to know and trust that someone else is going to come along that they're going to feel very wonderful about and is going to end up helping them become the parent they want to be. And so to try not to catastrophize it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
There's someone else. There's someone else that will be really right. There's no one right person out there that's going to help you become a parent.
I'm also looking, thank you, Carol. I'm also looking at some questions. We have some questions about halakhic, and none of us are experts in Jewish law. So we're going to defer those and refer you to your rabbi to ask about those things. Carol, do you want to take on or start the conversation about privacy versus secrecy?
I do. It's one of my favorite topics. Thank you. So there is a very big difference between privacy and secrecy, and they're often confused when it comes to conversations about donor conception. A lot of times when people say, well, that's private and it's none of their business, what they really mean is, I'm too embarrassed to talk about it. And they confuse the two. So secrets, with the exception of like birthday and anniversary surprises, are always about shame and embarrassment. And so generally the things that we keep secret and we don't share with others are things that we're afraid of what people would think of us if they knew. Private matters are just that. They are things that really aren't anyone else's business, but that there's no fear involved in what people would think if they knew it, or embarrassment about the information. And you can take almost any subject, and depending on the intent, it's either private or secret. So for example, how much money you make in a year's time is generally a very private matter. We don't share those things really socially. We don't talk about it very much except with very, intimate people. It's widely considered private. But let's say you haven't worked in 10 years. That's something that you probably wouldn't share widely because maybe you're embarrassed about it. Or maybe you haven't paid taxes in a number of years. So rather than it being a private matter about how much you paid in taxes, it's a secret. And so we often say, like, do we really want to put family creation and creating this family out of love and devotion in the same bucket as the things that are often kept secret, things like substance abuse and other forms of abuse, which maybe shouldn't be a secret, but they often are. So secrecy is when one does not share the truth of a child's conception with that child or children. And the people that are most intimate around them, like families of origin and grandparents, aunts, uncles, that kind of, when that information isn't shared with close family members, it's generally because it's a secret, and that means that the parents are afraid of what people would think if they knew. They're embarrassed. They often say things like, well, we don't want our child to feel different, or, we don't want spurned by, other family members. But honestly, it's generally to protect oneself and not to protect children. So we often say secrecy is when your children don't know the truth. And privacy is when you're not sharing the story in the grocery store line. So there's a section in the book that Dr. Berman referenced that has concentric circles describing how to think about how to talk about egg donation. And of course, in the middle of the circle is the child, because first and foremost, they need to know the truth of their genetic identity. And then in the same circle are medical professionals or any medical. Oh, wow, look at that. You put your finger right on it. Thank you. Any medical professional that's going to be working with your child obviously needs to know the truth of their conception. And then going out from there are generally family of origin, parents, siblings, very, very close friends, the people that you hang out together as family members. And that just makes your life a lot easier because you're not constantly keeping it a secret. Every time somebody says, oh, they're going to be really tall or they're going to have blue eyes, you don't get nervous about knowing the truth of how you created your family. And so that helped. But when you go to the park and you hear those questions like I did, like, why are your kids blonde, or why do they have red hair? Why do you have curly hair? You're not obligated to tell everybody at the park how you created your family. And at a certain point, it's definitely the child's private information to share as they wish, as they get older. So at a certain point, we transfer kind of the control over that information to our children so that they can answer those questions themselves. So that's the private versus secrecy. If you're not telling the person in the park because you're so embarrassed that you had to do egg donation and your eggs didn't work, or because your husband is infertile, then it's a secret. But if it's like, hey, I just want to push my kid on the swings and have a nice day out here in the park, and it's really not important that these people know how we created our family, that's more of a private matter. Now, with regard to telling older children, it's a little bit harder when you don't start practicing when your kids are very, very little or during the pregnancy. And in my experience, in my practice, I see so many people who come back when their kids are older, and for every year that goes by, their anxiety increases. By the time they have a 5 or a 6 or a 15-year-old, they are so panicked because they know they should have said something and they didn't. So what we like to say is it's really best to start the minute you're pregnant or the minute your kid enters your life. But if you didn't, do not despair. There are a lot of books available for kids of all different ages. Many of them are for very young children, but there's also a wonderful resource. There you go. There's a wonderful resource called the Donor Conception Network in the UK that has, there's Phoebe's family, that has a telling and talking series, which is for parents. It's not for children. That is broken down by developmental stages. So even if your kid is like between 11 and 17, they have a booklet for parents that helps you understand what they understand developmentally and talks about how to approach the subject with them. And then I always try to prepare parents for, here's what you might expect if you're talking to a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old who's gone off to college and you decide now is the time to talk to them. It's really helpful to be prepared. So here's what they might ask you. Here's what they're going to want to know. They might be, it's called the Donor Conception Network, dcnetwork.org, just answering a question. They might be very angry that you didn't tell them before. They might not, but they might be, and we have to kind of accept that. And the most important thing is that we embrace wherever they are and however they're feeling about it. This is true even if they're 7 and you're talking to them at any age. It's just important to kind of meet them where they are, even if their reaction makes us feel kind of uncomfortable.
Thank you, Carol. I think that was a really in-depth explanation, and I think you've offered a lot of important information. Halit, would you be willing to share your family building story, how your parents told you, and what your perspective is? And I know you've met many of your donor siblings or siblings, however you want to frame that. And if you could share that information, how that came to happen, and if they've had any different stories or different ways of coming to know about their donor conception.
I can definitely share my story. And I think for me, because my mom and dad told us about our conception from so early on, it never felt like a story that was really being told to us. It always just felt like our life and a very, very normal thing. I think because my mom was so vocal to us and so open with our family, our extended family, about us having an anonymous sperm donor, my twin brother Jonah and I were also very outgoing about it. And we went to a small school with a small Jewish community. So I think that helped us feel even more comfortable expressing how we were conceived to our friends. But basically, we found out since we were little. We read a bunch of books with my English teacher mom, and she told us a lot of stories in that way of how we were conceived. And then we just, I think, asked questions as we got older and got more curious. Every few years or every few months, we would ask my mom and dad if we could see our donor profile, and we would sit in her bed and read about that with my brother Jonah and my mom and I. And then when we were 8 years old, the donor sibling registry, so I think around 2002, was created with Brian Kramer, who is an only child conceived with donor sperm to a single mom. He and his mom created the donor sibling registry, and they were on, I think, Oprah, and my mom had been watching it, and she signed up immediately, and we were one of the first families on that website to connect with our half-sister Maddie, who is from LA, so across the country. And about a year later, after emailing back and forth, we actually went to New York City to meet her. And my twin brother Jonah and I and Maddie were the first of our big family now to actually meet and connect. And we did a segment on Good Morning America, which I actually just watched with my boyfriend, and we're little 8-year-olds sitting all nervous and giggly. But it made me remember how excited I was when we all met, and we were super nervous, and we were looking at how we all bit our nails. And then as the website got more and more popular, donor sibling registry, every year or so we would find out about a new half sibling. My mom and dad would say, hey, guess what? We got an email today. Guess who we found? And I think because it was such a gradual process with half siblings kind of joining the family as they found out about the website and got connected, it always felt really easygoing, and we always took in each half sibling in whichever way they wanted. So we have half siblings who jumped right on board and want to talk to everybody all the time. One of my half brothers wants to set up Zoom calls with all of us a lot. And then we have half siblings like Maddie, who after finding out about Jonah, my twin, and I said, okay, that's cool. I have a brother and I have a sister now. I'm done. I don't need any other ones. And that's actually my favorite part about my family, my half sibling family, is we really care about each other above all else. We put each other first before the donor, and that's where the strength of our family really comes into play. So whatever each sibling wants and whatever level they need, that's really what we respect. And the same goes with the half siblings who do have more interest in being connected to our sperm donor and those who don't. We always respect each other's wishes, and the ones who have contacted him don't really share it unless the other half siblings say, yeah, I want to hear what's going on.
You guys have set up some great ground rules. Terry, there's a lot of curiosity about why you chose, even 25 years ago when it wasn't so much in the public eye, to be open from the start with your children, how you made that decision.
I think as an educator who has always worked with children, I understand on a very visceral level that honesty is critical. And I had to push my husband along for the whole open, honest conversation. He was, at the beginning, he didn't want to tell our kids. And I knew that it was the right thing to do for both of them. My husband came along eventually and is now pretty open about how we conceived our kids. He's incredibly proud of them, as I am. But together, we knew it was going to be easier in the long run, and there was no secrecy. Secrecy felt wrong.
Great.
And
I also, really quick, I want to add, Mom, being different is awesome, and it's good to be unique. And I think that in every way, that's how y'all raised us. So being donor conceived was something that was different than so many of our friends, but we were always really proud of it because it made us unique. So that's a really good way to frame it too. Thank you.
Good point.
Lee, did any of the donor siblings that you met, did any of them learn later in life that they were donor conceived?
I think a few of them learned later than we did, but nobody learned after they were like young middle school or elementary school age. So no one had learned when they were 13, 14 after that. I think some parents waited until they were maybe like 7 or 8, and we had learned a lot earlier. But no, I do have a good friend who found out when she was 18 that she was donor conceived because my family was on a TV show and she was watching it with her sister, and she was like, Mom and Dad, there's this cool show that my friend's on about her half siblings and her sperm donor. And that's when her parents sat her down and told her. So that was very interesting coming from something that I did with my family. And a few of my friends actually had stories similar to that. So there are people in my life who did find out later, but none of our half siblings did.
I do want to add that that secrets in all kinds of secrets have a toxic effect in families. that secrets come out, secrets leak. There's lots of secrets sort of weave their way into the family dynamic, and it makes an impact. So, and it's so hard to keep a secret, to try to remember what you said when, and shore up all the different arenas that the secret touches, so that it's that we really recommend transparency. We really recommend to just talk about your family building story, because every family building story is a beautiful story.
I wanted to add one other thing about what is often called early disclosure. I call it just talking to kids from the very, very beginning. And somebody had a question that is attending that wanted to know why you should start so early. So I thought it would be helpful to talk about what many people who are donor conceived have told us, who have learned later. And later, there's a lot of research that shows that anything over about the age of 7 can be very, very challenging. Now, if you are on this Zoom and you have kids over the age of 7, please don't panic. But what we're trying to achieve is for kids to just grow up from the very beginning, understanding that one or both of their parents needed help in order to become parents, and that there was somebody else involved in that. And then that understanding will grow. But what we're trying to avoid is a moment in time where they had to unlearn something that they had always believed, and then learn something very new. Because even though kids may not know they're thinking this, everybody just assumes that they're related to both their parents the way their neighbors are, or their cousins are, or that their friends are related to their parents. They may not be able to define that as genetics, but they are assuming that. And then when something is, they're told at that moment, actually, we had help and you're related to this other person, it creates a moment of trauma when there's a before and an after. So what we're trying to avoid is the before and after. And the way you do that is that they've never known anything differently.
Is there anything else that anybody wanted to add about donor private talking to children as there's a new message, talking to children and telling them their family story?
I have, just to answer somebody's question from the chat, somebody asked me if somebody asks if I have siblings, what do I say? And most of the time I say I have a twin brother. But if I'm friends with somebody or a new friend asks me, I'll say, I have a twin brother, and then I have a bunch of half siblings. And normally people, I don't think, are assuming that that's from a donor, that my half siblings share the same donor. I think they assume it's like step siblings from.
A good conversation starter, huh?
Yes, but I'll say that is probably something where I practice my choice of privacy the most, is do I feel like telling people my story? And that normally stems from me either saying I have a twin brother or I have 15 half siblings. So that's just my answer to you who asked that question.
Lauren, I think one question, I was going to bring up the question somebody just wrote, because it's also personal for my family, is that, how do you share with your own kids if they were conceived in different ways? So some of my kids are biologically my husband and mine, conceived through IVF, and another is not biologically related to us. They are different ages in my family. I have 2 older kids who are biologically related to us, and the baby isn't. Again, I think what Lauren, you said is, or I think Carol said, it's just conversation. Like, we're just open about it. We've been open about it even before, I was even pregnant with our entire family. Some people in our expanded family could not understand it. I mean, it's a hard concept to swallow. They're like, embryo donation, what does that mean? You know, are you going to carry the child? Is there a surrogate? It's common knowledge for me, but really having to explain it to family was really interesting. And then having to talk about it with our kids was just, they didn't know anything different because they were part of the process. But it can be hard, and maybe there's some professional suggestions for people who have waited a little bit longer. One of the questions we had is somebody has a 6-year-old child. She is a single mom by choice, so clearly it is known that there was a donor sperm involved, but the second child is via embryo donation. So how do you recommend professionally addressing that when it wasn't brought up quite yet?
I'm sorry, I was reading the questions. Are you talking to me, Alana?
Yeah, so basically the question is one of our participants was asking, she has a child who is currently around 6 years old. She's a single mom by choice. So naturally there was sperm involved. That's no secret, especially since she's a single mom by choice. But now she has a younger child who is via donor embryo. She hasn't brought it up with either one of them at this point. How can she address it without having a sense of perhaps jealousy or something between them?
Right. So issues between children are issues, and they're not around the genetic issue, because particularly in children that young, the genetics, the idea of genetics doesn't really mean anything. That if there's jealousy among the kids, there are ways to handle the jealousy among these children, just like any other family formed any other way would handle jealousy among the kids. So I would say that donor conceived families bump into the same kind of issues that all other families bump into, and that being donor conceived, or one being conceived with this donor and one being conceived with that donor, especially at that young age, really doesn't fuel that issue.
Well, they'll just use it when it's convenient. Just like they'll use, you know, your mom's favorite, or, you know, you got a bigger helping of ice cream.
Exactly. I often tell a story about that teenagers are complicated. And so some of my patients have said to me, what if when my son says to me, well, you're not my mother anyway? And I say, well, probably the child who will say that is a teenager, and teenage years are 4 years of temporary insanity. And that my son, who Terry knows, once said to me, you're not just a bad mother, you're a bad psychologist too. And that you have to kind of, have a sense of humor, lock yourself in the bathroom sometimes with a playlist, a good playlist on your Spotify or your iPhone, and just know that teenagers are going to say things, and children are going to say things that sound either terrible or jealous or whatever. It's just, they're mad, and they need you to help them frame those emotions and understand those emotions and deal with their emotions. Anybody else have anything they wanted to add about that? We're getting close to time. Alana, are there any other items, questions that you wanted us to take on as we wind down? I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I think we can go to the last topic, which is how and when to tell your family and friends some real specifics, and also keeping in mind intergenerational issues, gender issues, cultural considerations.
I do want to reference back that Carol did take that question on, interwoven with some of the other questions. But I think the things we need to remember when we are taking this question on are the idea of privacy versus secrecy. That there are, I tell people in my office that if they have a family member who is going to be toxic, I often have people who have newly blended families. They have children with a first wife, they're going to use a donor with the second wife, and the first wife is very toxic or angry or is still grieving the divorce. So they asked me, should we tell our children, our other children, because what if she uses that, she learns about it and she uses that against us? And I think that's a good reason to tread very lightly. So there are people who will use this information in a toxic way. And again, your mind is always centered on your child's best interest. What is in your child's best interest? And then there are cultural, sometimes a grandparent's culture or a great aunt's culture will not allow them to accept the child. And again, we need to frame the question as in the child's best interest. How can we handle this information sensitively so that our child does not feel harm from family members or extended family members because of this private information?
Thank you. And I think one last question, because I think that this is a good one. And this goes back to our original conversation around donors. So again, we get lots of questions. How do you know that a known donor might be better? And this is a specific question around what if my known donor goes off and gets married one day and has children of his own? Will my child feel rejected that their dad never goes to their own birthday parties, but now goes to their birthday parties of his own children?
I'd like to hand that question off to Carol because she has a lived experience of this. So,
Well, the woman who gave us the egg it's not the same thing because she wasn't a known donor at the beginning. We became known to each other many years later, so we didn't go into that way. But I would like to answer it because I think the answer to that child who may have those feelings is, of course, that's really valid. And they might feel really badly that they don't have a dad to do those things. But the person who is the known donor, as we'll call him, never intended to be a father per se. And that's the difference, is that somebody who has a dad from the beginning is very different than somebody who helps somebody become a mother, but never intended to be a father. That doesn't mean at times it may not be painful to that child, that guy doesn't want to be their dad. And that's our job, is to help kids through that. But I think that's the difference, is the intention at the beginning and the arrangement that they had. Does that make sense?
I think so.
You think so? Okay.
I think so. I think it's a good answer. I think there's lots of information that we're able to provide from our own personal feedback, but also I think you're definitely an expert in the field, especially from the research that you've done and that you're able to share with our audience. So thank you. So that is time right now. We are at 9 o'clock. Again, another hour, and we still did not answer all of our questions. They keep coming in. Thank you for being an amazing, amazing group of listeners. We will be sending out an email with a survey for feedback as well as follow-up resources. And we do want you to sign in to our Instagram Live on egg freezing next week with Dr. Maslow, fertility specialist and egg freezing expert at Extend Fertility. Additionally, we will be having a holobake on September 17th at 8 p.m. alongside Dr. Beth Riconti, women's health physician and author of Braided. Please follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Jewish Fertility Foundation. And a sincere thank you so much for all of our panelists. You are all very open, and just the fact that you're able to share your own personal stories with your expertise has been super helpful for our followers and our audience. And we can definitely see that in all of the amazing questions that our attendees have offered. Thank you very much. And stay tuned. Who knows? There might be a part 3 coming soon to you. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.